So, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. My name is Philip Shepherd. I am the Secretary General of IPRA, the International Public Relations Association, and you're all very welcome to today's Thought Leadership webinar. Today is an interesting sort of a niche topic within public relations, and that's public affairs. We're delighted that we have as our speaker today, Dr. Stuart Thompson. Stuart is a UK-based public affairs and communications consultant. He's also an author. He's just finished a book called Reputation in Business: Lessons for Leaders, which will be out on Routledge in late 2022. And if you're an IPRA member, you can get a discount on Routledge books. Stuart has also been listed as one of the UK's top 100 public affairs consultants. And in 2020, he won the Best Current Affairs Influencer at the Online Influence Awards. So without further ado, I'm going to disappear from the screen and hand over to Stuart. If you have questions for him, you can pose them at any time during the presentation in the Q&A tab, which you see is the middle tab above on the column on your right. And I will then take the questions to Stuart at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to go and leave it to Stuart Thompson.
Brilliant. Thank you, Philip. And hello, everyone. As Philip said, it's morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And it's always slightly embarrassing to hear your own sort of past sort of read out in front of you. But the main thing is the book. That's the cheap plug before I start today. So what I'm going to talk about is public affairs. Again, as Philip said, a relatively niche part of PR. More focused on public policy, influencing public policy. And that means a lot of the time that we are working particularly with political audiences, but also others as well, civil servants and other opinion formers. So what I want to do is sort of have a look at the changing nature of engagement as far as political communications go. Mainly because I don't think, and this is our own fault as a profession, not the fault of anybody else, I hasten to add, that public affairs is not always hugely well understood across the PR profession. But my contention is that if if those political audiences aren't managed, then effectively it's risk, it's additional risk. So for me, public affairs is fundamentally about good risk management, and that impacts on all of us, all organizations, whether they're commercial, whether they're charities, NGOs, individuals, it doesn't matter. So we all have a reason to take our public affairs seriously. And why is that then? Why do I put it in the risk management terms? Well, I put it in risk management terms fundamentally because governments have real power in their hands. They can change laws. They can introduce new regulations. They can alter competition. They can raise and lower taxes. They can fundamentally impact on the way that any organization operates. So they have a range of powers that other audiences don't have. So left unmanaged, I believe, organizations are failing to manage their risks. They don't take that political side seriously. But done well, it opens up opportunities. So there's a very, good positive side of plus points on that. It deals with the threats, but ignored, then it inflicts potential damage. So what I'm going to suggest in the next sort of 35 minutes or so, we've got about 40 minutes all in all before we can take some questions at the end. So what I'm going to suggest in the session will show the valuable role, as I think, that public affairs can play, how it can be an effective part of good engagement, and how also we need to think about it as a key aspect of reputation management. And I'm going to give you, hopefully, the tools needed to do that political engagement effectively. That's my task anyway. Let's hope I deliver on all those things. So. We operate in a very competitive environment, and I use that word quite deliberately, especially when it comes to dealing with government. There are lots of organizations looking to influence public policy, public policy outcomes. So the challenge that we face really is to be better at it than others. Governments have a limited bandwidth. They can't listen to everybody. They can't engage with everybody. They don't have unlimited capacity, or they don't have unlimited parliamentary time to change new laws or introduce new legislation. So the way that you engage, the people you talk to, your understanding of the political process, and again, I appreciate that we've got people from literally all across the world, on this session today. So each political system is different. I can't sit here and tell you exactly how to engage with that political system because they vary hugely, as do the personalities involved as well. But you have to be better in your domestic setting at understanding that political process than others because you're in competition for the attention of those policymakers. Again, I use the word competitive deliberately, and it applies whatever type of organization you are. But your engagement also, therefore, needs to think about reputation. Because quite starkly, if your organization, your leadership team have a poor reputation, then they're more likely to be on the receiving end of government attention. Unwarranted, as you may contend, unnecessary, but still government attention, adverse government attention. So you can think that it's unwarranted, you can think that it is unfair, but actually governments make the decisions and the pronouncements and their policies on the basis of the information that they have available to them. So they think that they are being perfectly sensible. They think they are making perfectly rational decisions. But the reality is, in those circumstances, we have failed in public affairs or across the PR profession because we haven't engaged effectively with that political audience. We haven't provided the information they require, the data, the evidence, the real life experience that comes with, your sort of organization. So that's what you really need to deliver to them to educate that audience to make sure they don't, implement that change which you would see as unfavorable as well. So make sure that we don't fail. I don't think it's the political audience's fault. It's not their failure. I would contend it's our failure. We also tend to focus sometimes a little bit too much on the politics. And look, very many of us are, very interested politically. If you want to call us a political geek or nerd or whatever, I plead guilty to that a lot. But where it comes to the day job, where it comes to my public affairs, my helping clients get their engagement right, it's important. Yes, you have to think about the politics, but you have to dig away underneath that as well, and don't get completely distracted by the politics of it all. Here in the UK, as many of you will have seen and read in the media over the last few days, the Prime Minister faced a challenge which he successfully saw off. But what does that mean? So you can become absolutely fixated on the politics of who did what, when, etc. But the reality is, what you're really trying to do, as far as the client is concerned, is dig away underneath that, look at the implications, and give them some real actions that they can pursue on the back of the politics which is taking place, over the top of us. So, we can get sad and geeky about the politics, but we can't get distracted by that. That's only part of the way in which government overall operates. And I appreciate that people have different systems, and there's international pressures that operate differently in different jurisdictions as well. But what public affairs really is trying to do is about seeking influence on public policy. That's what we're, regardless of where we are, that's what we are trying to do. And that means thinking about all aspects of government, not just the politics. Part of the, talking today about, what we can do and how we can do our public affairs more effectively is also about recognizing the changes, in governments, in the way that politics and government have changed and have shifted. And politics particularly is always moving. Government is always moving. Policies come up, new issues come up, people particularly, come and go. There are constant shifts of those tectonic plates that we need to be aware of and need to advise on as well. But alongside that, what I would think of as normal change, normal operation of government, has come, I think, some wider shifts as well. Again, varying between countries, but I think, generally applicable. And all of those have implications for public affairs. So one of those is the size of the state, the central government operations. And in many countries, it continues to grow in size. And at the very least, partly as a result of people wanting to see government as taking action. You can show strong muscular government if government, the state, using the state, is doing things, intervening. Now, COVID, certainly, was a key driver of that. Many governments offered support for particular sectors, individual workers as well, many which got involved in the vaccine rollout as well. And now, as the economic outlook looks increasingly not very pleasant, that role for the state, arguably pushed by COVID, doesn't look to be diminishing anytime soon. So, but I would contend that actually that predates COVID to an extent as well. Again, not everywhere, not to the same extent, but there has been that general, shift. So what that means is that the policy responsibilities of government have grown. And as government grows, therefore, the tentacles of government grow across organisations. So you may have been involved in a sector that, I don't know, maybe didn't take its government relations particularly, public affairs particularly seriously, but now as the responsibilities of government grow, you may find that you're directly impacted now in a way that you wouldn't have been 2, 3, 4 years ago. So we all have to pay a constant attention to what government, in terms of its policies and its positions and its drivers, are doing. You may suddenly become part of that wider scope of government action. But I'd also look at, I think one of the challenges that results from this sort of wider government growth, state growth, and that level of public expectations. People continue to expect their governments to do more and be more interventionist, is the official support around governments. So here in the UK, we would think of those as the civil servants, independent, policy, support that is available to government. Officials, again, that part of government often gets called different things depending on where we are, across the world. But effectively, more people are needed to deliver those additional responsibilities. If government is doing more, then of course it needs more people underneath that to help deliver those policies. So what level of support will be available to government? Will it need to come from outside in future, or will the size of the state itself continue to grow? Again, I don't know the answer to that. It will vary between countries, but it's certainly a development that's going to be something important for us to look at if we're trying to influence that public policy debates and outcomes. Now, look, this isn't a talk about politics per se and the rise of populism. And again, people will have different views about even what populism really means. It's a hugely debated topic, maybe in some countries more than others. And I'm not going to explore it in any great detail. But it does appear that governments, the government party or parties, again, depending on where we are, tend to follow the crowd a little bit more. And that means following the loudest crowd. Again, that has implications for engagement if you know that this sort of vocal voice, loud voice, is what you may face as part of your engagement process. Governments across the world, if you look at, say, the Edelman Trust Barometer and other studies as well, has a problem of declining trust. Admittedly, from a reasonably low base as well, so maybe that's not saying huge amounts. But government and politics has a trust problem, continues to have a trust problem. COVID helped a bit, I believe. If you look at some of the more recent studies, there was certainly a bit of a spike upwards in a positive way, but the general trend is still downwards. There is an issue of external pressure as well. Now, I'm not sure whether all these things that I've already touched on are interrelated. I have a sneaky suspicion they probably are. I don't think any of these things operate on their own. But what is clear, I think, is that campaigns, often using social media, etc., really target government in quite an aggressive way. And the media themselves, in many places, are also, campaigners. So that part of the external pressure is part of the environment in which, again, we have to do our public affairs. Look, and I'm sure there are many other changes that people can point to as well, that you would want to look at. But that challenging nature, that changing nature of government has implications for public affairs and for engagement as well. How we engage, who we engage with, the channels we use, etc. So, where does that environment take us, and what are the implications of some of those things as well? Well, the first thing I would say is when we're putting our thoughts together and our campaign together is, first of all, to start by looking at inside. Look at inside your organisation. Again, too often in public affairs, we tend to become obsessed by the politics and the political audience. We immediately go outwards. We immediately want to do lots of stuff, lots of activity, which is fine. But instead, actually, start by looking inwards at your own organizations, because most organizations have a rich seam of information already available to them. So, so we often underestimate that internal look first as part of the strategy development. And that can mean looking at previous campaigns. So it's doubtful that an organization, if it's starting just to get involved in its, its public policy, political engagement, was doing it for the first time, there may well be other examples that you can, look to. Well, in which case, what worked well, what were the learnings, etc. So pick up on those. They often then also lead to existing political contacts and existing wider stakeholder contacts as well, that you already have, a ready-made database, if you like. Probably doesn't exist in a database form, invariably, but you've got those contacts and those networks that you can start to utilize often straight away without having to go through all the sort of cold calling and the new approach would entail. So but that does mean you just have to be a little bit aware of over contact as well, over utilizing those same contacts as well, because the reality is that the responsibility for talking to these organizations or these individuals may sit within different parts of an organization as well. So it's not just the sole preserve of the public affairs team or whatever we're called. It varies in organization, external affairs, government relations, etc. Not the sole preserve of that particular team, but may sit within a policy team, a wider PR team. Often can have political engagement as well without thinking about it in public affairs terms. So you've got to try and capture all of that and bring together the work of all those teams when you're developing your strategy as well. And there's always new people joining organizations, new policy developments taking place within policy teams, etc. So look to bring those new opportunities, those new contacts, those new experiences, those new relationships, bring that all to the benefit of your strategy. So that need to look inwards, I think, is ongoing. It's not a sort of one-off process. It should be ongoing. So you can think about strategy, but just think about keeping it going as well. And I think that internal look also helps us all, I think, regardless of whatever area of communications we're involved in, it also helps us just think about what we're doing to help avoid that business as usual, type approach, which we can, it's very easy for us all to lapse into that. But if you're bringing that, new experience and wider experience from across an organization in, it can help to avoid that. Talk to others. Really, I suppose is the general plea, because you'll already have existing, connections, networks, and experience, all of which will be relevant, to your public affairs. And the strategy development. I mean, another, I think, key component of public affairs is that, yes, politics is at its core. That parliamentary audience, depending on where we are, is often a fundamental of what we're all doing in terms of trying to secure the change in terms of public policy. Those audiences often use special languages. It's all a little bit difficult to see. They have special terms, they all have their jargon, as do all sectors and all professions, I hasten to add. But that's what often puts people off. They don't really understand how it works. That can be learned. You can develop that over a period of time. You can gain experience doing that. That's absolutely fine. The other part of what we do is effectively communication. So, whatever sort of communications and PR role you have for those on the call today and watching later, what you will see is some of what I talk about here. And when you read about public affairs and listen to podcasts and others, you'll think, well, that's communications. And it is. It is just about good communications. But the reality is we deal with this slightly different audience. And politicians, again, I understand it varies between countries, not all of the same. But for most with, democratic systems, that means that, they have limited terms for which they serve, and they have to then put themselves forward for re-election. And even those in, non-democratic or less democratic systems, those without election potentially as well, still have to be seen to deliver. So that bit, regardless of the system, doesn't change. There's something in that nature and need to show progress and delivery and putting themselves up for, election in some systems, which makes that political audience fundamentally different. And again, this isn't a session to talk, in long-winded ways about, how to put strategies together and that. But I did want to just take a moment just to highlight some of those key points. Really to say, look, fundamentally, when you're looking at pulling all this together, that's fine. When you're looking at pulling the strategy together, that's fine. But always fundamentally ask yourself what it is you are trying to achieve. What is that public policy change or shift that you want to deliver? And then you can do your SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Then you can look at the current position, the situation that you find yourself in. You can then, look at your stakeholder analysis or your customer analysis and competitors, depending on which sector we're talking about here. But the more information you have, the more insight you have from all these different areas, the more effective your strategy will be. And that's a pretty, across the board point. But let's say, always be really clear about what it is you're seeking to achieve. Political engagement is fine. Developing a network is fine. That it doesn't have to be particularly sophisticated, but I would always encourage you to think that part through in some level of detail. And that really think about that political process, understanding the development of policies. How does that shift? How does that work over a period of time? Again, it will vary between whichever system you're operating under. I appreciate that. But I think you can think of that process as as I've tried to, indicate here, a sort of a flow chart. This is a flow chart of some description. Anyway, sort of directional analysis, whatever we want to call it. But it has various stages. Now, the political part, political interventions can happen at any stage, often depending on the level of media, social media, or wider coverage of the particular issue. But if you think about it in the early stages as being the emergence of the issue, that can come about because of a change in maybe a change in government policy itself. It sort of initiates that new issue or new thinking around an area. Often it's a result of external pressure, a campaign, by a charity or an NGO, a number of different ways that it can emerge. But it does emerge. It comes through in some, has some sort of level of profile. The policy is then developed. Again, if you can think about this, I suppose, in a sort of a civil servant official sort of way, as that particular policy area, as that issue is worked on. You then move on to the stage where there are official government papers, maybe consultations, if again, depending on the system. It may be more around, speeches or sometimes civil servants, officials will go out there and talk at conferences to draw in wider stakeholder analysis and and feedback as the policy is developed. And once that development is done, then you might get the official sort of political position where a minister or somebody senior will stand up and say, okay, this is what we have agreed, this is what we're going to do, and then it will then move on to the legislative stage. Often the legislation the bill going through Parliament, something along those lines. Now, that's a general rule. That's a general progression of policy. To say the politics can intervene at various points along that, but again, my thought to you would be that the earlier that you can intervene in this process, the earlier that you can think about and plan and actually execute your public affairs, the higher your level of influence. In other words, the earlier you get involved, the more chance you have of success. Why? Well, it's partly a human nature point, isn't it? If the piece of legislation exists, if it's there's a document with lots of words written down in it, it's quite difficult to change those words. It's had all the development, it's had the political positions, it's had the governmental support, all of those things. So it's quite difficult to change that. Whereas if you can get involved earlier, whilst that initial thinking is being done, you're more likely to be able to bring your expertise, your reputation for knowing what you're doing into that policy making process. So always think about the early rather than leaving it too late. Apologies, I know this slide hasn't come up particularly well, and apologies for that. Well, this was my attempt, if you like, at trying to show the different influences, the different pressures that apply on a political audience. Here I've used a sort of, elected member of parliament in the UK setting, councillors, mayors, MSPs in Scotland, MEPs, Brussels, etc. Generally you can apply this, he says, I think you can generally apply this to a political audience wherever they're operating. But it's a case of identifying the pressures on them, because if you can understand the pressures on them, and I think that's everything from, even their career prospects and what they're thinking about in terms of but you can think about it in terms of the media. You can think about it in terms of, the hyper local, their constituency, i.e. their direct electorate and the campaigns and, media and others that are going on in their very local area. It can be about, colleagues. It can be a whole range of different things, but it's important to recognize those, because all of those pressures and lobbying, I hasten to add, and the public affairs engagement by you and by others are all exerting those influences. So out of all those influences come the positions, the actions, and eventually the statements of that political audience. So the more that you can understand those pressures, the more that you can counteract them potentially, the more that you can challenge them, the more that you may wish to get involved in them directly to change the course of that, or attempt to change the course of that pressure on them as well. So again, in that sense, good communications advice. It's about knowing and understanding the audience. Where it comes to the engagement itself, I think you really have to think about what your briefing, what your engagement is really trying to achieve. What you're trying to do is hold attention over time. I've got a slide in a moment again, which is fairly time-based to try and illustrate, some of these points as well. And what you're really trying to do is define the issue more effectively and better than others. You're also using the language of that audience. Maybe specialist and politicals, often, not specialist, if that doesn't come across as too rude. You're also trying to bring some personality into it as well. You're trying to get some connectivity with that audience. You might look for sort of small, quick wins to try and establish that relationship of trust, because it activates the trust. And sometimes the smaller the change, the bigger the level of trust that can engender. Not always the case, but that might be a good thing. Sometimes you may be looking to educate. Sometimes you might be looking to motivate them. Sometimes you're trying to get them to act as a champion. Other times you might be trying to get them to do something not very public. You know, sometimes this isn't about loud engagement. It's about quiet. It's about effectiveness. It's about them talking to colleagues. That's fine. That doesn't have to be done in a big picture way or a particularly, high profile type way. So you might want to think about it, I suppose, think about it more easily in terms of a conversation. That's what you're trying to do. And in that conversation, you're trying to set out the problem. You need to move on to the solution. And I always think the solution is absolutely fundamental to good public affairs. Don't just go in and moan, give some form of solution. You need to demonstrate some humility in that conversation, deference, dare I say so, to many of these audiences. You tailor it, of course. Again, that's good communications. You're thinking about their needs, and you're developing that relationship over a period of time. And if you can then build that trust, then you develop credibility. And in that credibility, you develop that trusted relationship. And I think that has two sets of implications. I think the more benign one is that you're trying to establish that relationship. I think that's absolutely fine. But if you fail to do that, the less benign part is that you failed to engage effectively. You then fail to deliver. And I've just been told, I didn't realize this, I think we can increase the size of the slide. So actually, if that works a little better for people, apologies. I'll tell you what, let me just flick back to that previous slide, just in case that helps people for a moment. I'll just give people, you might be able to see the implications and the pressures that I was talking about just now as well. So anyway, the engagement, but say, imagine you're the scenario, if you're sort of on the receiving end, if you're the stakeholder, you're the one in the position of authority, and the organization that you are looking at dealing with has no credibility. You don't trust them. That's the problem. And then you run the risk of, intervention. And I think the key point is about delivery. That's really the fundamental point, whatever audience, but particularly in this public affairs thing, about delivery. And actually, there's a very good, if you want more reading recommendations, How to Run a Government by Sir Michael Barber is an excellent book where it comes to looking at delivery. So look, a couple more diagrams. Sorry, you'll probably get the idea that I do quite like my diagrams. But anyway, this is my view of how you move along that continuum, that time continuum, from starting a relationship through to becoming a trusted advisor. And for me, being a trusted advisor is all about being able to have regular contact and engagement, and in a very fluid way between you and that intended audience. But you start with that reputation piece at the start. You can then move along from the initial contact, the meeting, regular engagement, ongoing dialogue, and it's about expertise. So again, we bring in some of those wider, thought leadership. It's wider communications issues. So I would point to all of those things. But that's what we're trying to do. That's the continuum we're trying to move along all these times. And another key point that we've, are invariably involved in, again, you can think about these as good communications, but it's about thinking more broadly about what will help influence government. Now, that means working with others very often. If you are the only ones saying these things, you obviously have a vested interest, of course. Others don't. So you have to think about the wide range of allies and the active participants that you may want in your public affairs campaign. Again, I've listed some here. You will think of others. I have absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. But I think one of the key changes more recently is that it's moved more from a situation like this to more of a situation like this. And what I mean by adding those additional arrows is that instead of becoming a dialogue between you and other businesses or a business organization, the businesses will also talk to the communities, will now also talk to the suppliers. In other words, there's more interaction and maybe, dare I say, even less control for you. It's not a sort of command and control arrangement. It's very much you setting, maybe setting the broad parameters, if you think about it in that context, you setting the broad parameters and allowing those other audiences to maybe take that information and be more active with it, really. You don't control it, you allow them to be active. That can be a quite difficult position for many organisations to find themselves in. It's certainly quite a different position for many of us are used to in public affairs. We normally provide briefings and it's all very controlled. This is less control, and I see a position of less control, not more control, being the norm. I just want to finish with a couple of thoughts, I suppose, really around thought leadership. More than anything else, I think thought leadership has become, again, increasingly important within the public affairs space, primarily because it is helping us to build reputation. And what governments increasingly want is, as I've already indicated, data, evidence, and real life experience. That's what they need to hear from, so they know that the policies that they're going to implement will be effective, but were deliverable and then effective. So your standing with that audience is about your reputation. It makes you the trusted voice. It opens up potential new contacts. It's also about recognizing where you're weak and doing something about that. So we're almost back to that first slide about risk management, but internal risk management as well as external risk management as well. Again, communications will tell us that there are very many ways of developing your thought leadership, but I would absolutely stress that as an increasingly important role within public affairs. And I suppose, finally, I just wanted to spend a moment just helping avoid failures, really. In my experience, I've been doing this, now a very long time. When you put it on your bio, you say has over X amount of years experience. And unfortunately, I see the years ticking past. So it's nearly at 25 years experience. And that's good in some ways, but maybe slightly depressing in others. One is the one that I've already mentioned, which is we end up thinking too much about the politics of it. We get distracted. We don't think enough about the delivery and the governmental side of things. We are equally bad sometimes communicators. We're not always great communicators, and that can mean that we end up thinking like politicians, not thinking like government, and that impacts on our messaging as well. We might think of what's politically acceptable rather than deliverable, for instance. Campaigns that fail to learn. Again, that's a general communications point, I think, but public affairs is no different. We can lose sight of the importance of civil service, of the officials. We think about advisors. We think about the politicians. We can be overtaken by events. There's often wider, sometimes international events as well. We do suffer in that competitive, in that idea of having it being a competitive environment, that simply opponents are better than us. They're more effective than us. Maybe they convey the solutions better than we do. Maybe they've come up with a solution that we haven't come up with. We've concentrated too much about moaning about things. And another main failing that I've encountered certainly is that you just get your timing all wrong. You think that you end up looking at what you want to deliver, what you think the audience want and should be listening to, and the timetables that you need to work to. But actually, that's not what works with the system. And we do have to interact with the system, the political system of our particular jurisdictions. That's absolutely fundamental. So thank you for listening to me for those about 40 minutes. That's me. It's always slightly weird looking at a picture of yourself sort of twice on the screen. It's a bit Harry Potter, where you think that the picture of yourself is going to start moving in a moment, which is a bit weird. But there are some contact details there. Another very cheap plug for the book, which Philip very kindly mentioned at the start as well. But look, we've got plenty of time for questions. I'm more than happy to talk about any element of government, politics, public affairs, whatever. Philip, over to you. Thank you.
Stuart, thank you very much. That was excellent, and something I particularly appreciated, as I'm a former lobbyist, having based in Brussels for many years. So everybody, please, if you have questions, there's a Q&A tab, which you see is in the middle of the column on your right. So type anything in there you'd like to ask Stuart right now, or indeed you can raise your hand and I will invite you to the stage to speak to Stuart directly. And perhaps while we're waiting for that, a question from me. you mentioned both these things, but I wanted about sort of linking them. Has populism, in particular driven by social media, reduced the influence of the professional lobbyist over the last few years?
I don't know about reducing it. I think it's made it more complicated, absolutely. And I think that we've all had to think about, and I didn't touch on this today particularly, but the role that social media can play for us as well as professional lobbyists and public affairs. Because just as I'm gonna hugely simplify, and apologies for that in advance, but if you can see campaigns absolutely using social media to target politicians and other audiences, then effectively a good campaign on a positive perspective as us as public affairs professionals can do exactly the same. So we've had to, and I think this often happens, across the piece in communications, we learn the lessons from external campaigners, and we bring some of that, best practice, some of that good thinking to what we're trying to do as well. So I think it's undoubtedly made it more complicated. It's offered some opportunities as well, because it's where politicians are. It's offered some channels that maybe weren't there, initially, but equally it then does bleed into those other areas of PR and communications as well, which we need to, frankly, work together on. Which is, if a politician says something outrageous on social media, how do we deal with it? Okay, there's a public affairs angle, but obviously there's more of often a wider reputation, corporate positioning, type issues to contend with as well. So I think it's, I don't think it's increased or reduced. I think it's just made it more complicated.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have a question from Anna Zakada. She's a doctor working at the Cyprus University of Technology. And it's a question concerning thought leadership. Can too much thought leadership erode rather than build trust and credibility? Indeed, could overexposure dilute the influence and damage the trusted advisor perception?
I think the answer to that, Anna, would be absolutely yes. I think if you, as with any, again, back to good communications, as with any good communications, you think about the amount of exposure that you have to any audience, but particularly political audience, that frankly, if you're seen as stalking them, you're going to get into all sorts of problems. Whereas if it's useful, regular, that's absolutely fine, but absolutely not inundating them. That will work. Too regular, too much, not specific enough, not really what they're interested in, that damages. And again, I think that hopefully that's part of the reason why I mentioned in that sort of, slide on the internal, that looking inwards part, is that because very often we aren't necessarily privy, but should be, to all the communications, particularly political, and I'm talking about civil servants, officials, politicians, etc., locally as well as nationally as well, sometimes, and intranationally as well. So we talk about sort of Brussels and other organisations as well that you could well be relevant to the organisation. Because we're not always privy to those that information going out there, we can't control it. So we may have, apologies, let me labour this slightly further, but we have made one set of contact. That's fine. We may go back to that stakeholder in 6 months' time, and that may well be fine. Some new information or an update or something. That's great. But actually, across the organisation, the policy team have sent in 2 papers in that 6 months. Maybe the PR team or the external comms team have sent a couple of media releases there as well, because they think they're relevant, because they sit on a committee. So suddenly, it's not sort of one piece of information that we know of in that 6 months. It's suddenly 5, 6, 7. And then that damages the reputation. So again, the more that we can, and it's our responsibility, which is nobody's fault, but the more that we can plug into those different bits across an organisation to prevent that from happening will mean that we're all more effective than we would be otherwise.
Lovely, thank you for that. So perhaps another question from me. This may be the last one if we see nothing else on the list. And it's something that I recall, which was from again my time in Brussels, which was the different levels necessary in what was often sometimes technical arguments. We may something for example from the food industry. I would talk to people in the industry who knew their stuff, who would give me a highly technical argument about why certain political outcome was a bad thing. And then I'd have to go, for example, to a member of the European Commission who would be a little more involved in the subject. You then talk to a member of the European Parliament who would be a generalist, and maybe if we get up to the illustrious level talking to Commissioner, there will be a super generalist. And I wonder, is that generally the case in national politics and in other institutions?
In my experience would be similar, yes, absolutely. You know, I mean, we in the UK, also in the Westminster government, UK government, you know, have our two chambers. We have the House of Commons, which are the directly elected bit, and we've got the House of Lords, which is an anachronism in many ways, but, you know, and very, very largely appointed. In those circumstances, you could say, well, actually, the House of Lords, because they're appointed, do have some experts in there. So there are, you know, there's some exceptions to that general rule, Philip, I think, and that may be one. But as a general point of principle, when you're talking to the officials, when you're talking to the civil servants, for instance, you know, most of those have been there a long time. They absolutely know their area. They're talking to a lot of, you know, the stakeholders. They're getting this information in there. So your level of ability to communicate with them in a meaningful way with some you know, some hard facts and some proper jargon and things will be higher. When you start going into that more directly elected political realm, then, you know, their time is often shorter. Their knowledge of the sector is often, although not exclusively, often, you know, less. And I think in some ways that almost sort of illustrates the way that not that we just communicate in that one-to-one setting, but also the way that we do our briefing papers, the way that we convey that material to different audiences. So, look, you know, typically when we're writing the briefing papers, we're trying to do it in a couple of sides of A4. That's about it, because of the attention span of, you know, many of the audiences that we're dealing with. Having said that, you know, a more expert audience, those officials, will take more information. They'll take 4, 6, 8 sides, because that's what they need to really get to grips with a policy to make it work, so it will stand up to the political scrutiny that it has to go through for them when they deliver it to that political audience, because it has to be robust for them to deliver it. Equally, and I was on a session just, I think, unfortunately, COVID times means that timetables don't quite mean anything in the same way that they used to. I'm pretty sure it was earlier this year. And it was a conversation that was taking place with, I think, a former Prime Minister of Belgium and a very senior minister within the Irish you know, government, both former positions. But their line was one side of A4. If you can't say everything you need to within one side, I wouldn't have read, in that former position, I wouldn't have read it. So that very much gives a you know, clear illustration of our need to, you know, tailor the product, the materials that we are delivering depending on the audience. But also, again, we're back to that internal point, I think, draw on the level of expertise from others in an organisation. So, look, I might be able to brief an MP, or, you know, on the basis of my knowledge, but I'm not going to be able to brief a much more in-depth civil servant. I'm going to need to bring somebody much more, or somebody much closer to that policy to be able to do that briefing. I might be able to facilitate, I can direct, I can do all that stuff, but in terms of the detail, I'm going to have to think about who I bring to that audience as well. Again, that's, I think, part of what we as public affairs practitioners, you know, need to do. We need to recognise those levels of strengths and you know, abilities within the audience, and then recognise our own failures and weaknesses sometimes, and bring in others to do that. So, sorry, that was a very long-winded way of absolutely agreeing with you.
Lovely, thank you for that. And we have a question from Robert Masters, who runs his own consultancy in Australia. And it's a question about approach. In an engagement process, do you seek to build public support for your campaign before approaching ministers? Or do you believe it's best to do the opposite, so you can create a trusted environment? So it's sort of the external.
Yeah, that's a really good. That's a very, very good question, and I think in a very I'm loath to say a very political way, but a very public affairsy way, would say it depends. It varies. I think it really does depend on the issue that you are dealing with at the time and the audience that you're dealing with. You know, are they particularly sensitive? Is it a more broadly difficult time for them? So if this sort of external pressure comes from, you know, left field or right field, whichever direction, actually are they going to feel under undue pressure too quickly? In my experience, generally, if you try and build the external, I'm going to say pressure, it may not be hugely public in that sense, so apologies if I'm sort of slightly dancing on the head of a pin, but you know, too much external pressure, too much profile externally first, what you tend to get is a reaction from the political audience, which will say, look, why didn't you come and see me about this first? So in effect, you've embarrassed me publicly. And again, coming back to the nature of that audience, public embarrassment equals votes. So you effectively, you may cost me votes because you've gone big on the media first of all. Whereas you could have given me, you know, you could have given me some notice. We could have worked together. We could have, you know, solved this issue. So I think that's the balance that we're always trying to work, you know, within. That's the pressurized context in which we're operating. And I think related to that is also the other consideration is that sometimes, and very often, a lot of the public affairs issues that we all end up dealing with are a bit boring. They're quite technical. They don't lend themselves to those bigger campaigns. And I think, and you know, that just has to be in our thinking as well. So apologies, that's probably again long-winded, not particularly coherent and you know, rambling answer. But I think it does depend. But I would worry slightly about that external pressure and getting sort of an, you know, an opposite reaction from that particularly political audience, rather than trying to build it over time.
Lovely, Stuart, thank you very much. I think we're going to close the session now. So thank you once again to Stuart for both the presentation and fielding our questions. Thank you to you, the audience from all over the globe today. And just a reminder, our next IPRA Thought Leadership webinar is going to be on the 14th of July. So that's great for everybody except for the French, for whom it is National Day. So once again, Stuart, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you all today.